On the shelf, like soldiers awaiting on the shelf, like soldiers awaiting orders. She counted her children, 8 heads of hair, fanned across 3 mattresses, some dark like their father, some honey blonde like her own mother had been, back in Ohio, when the world still made a kind of sense. She counted them before she let herself feel anything, before grief, before fear, before the low, grinding weight of reality settled into her chest like a stone dropped in still water. 8. All 8 still here. That was how she started each day in the autumn of 1874 on the Bowman homestead outside Mill Haven, Kansas, a cluster of weathered buildings pressed into the flatlands like God had set something down and forgotten to pick it up. The main house had 3 rooms and a leaking roof. The barn leaned southwest at an angle that had worried her husband James for the last 2 years of his life. The well was good, deep, and cold, which was the only mercy the land had offered without asking something in return. James had been dead 4 months. He hadn't gone heroically. No outlaws, no stampede, no flood. A fever had taken him in 6 days, 6 ordinary, merciless days, and left Clara alone with 8 children ranging in age from 14-year-old Thomas down to little May, who had just turned 2 and still toddled to the door each morning, calling for her daddy with a voice so innocent it split Clara's chest open like an axe through dry wood. People in Mill Haven had been kind at first. 3 weeks of casseroles and gentle words and men offering to look at the barn. But kindness in a frontier town had a shelf life, and after it expired, life resumed its indifferent pace, and Clara Bowman was simply another widow holding a fraying rope in both hands, trying not to let go. The problem, the central suffocating problem, was the land. James had borrowed against it $200 from the Mill Haven Merchants Bank, signed and sealed, due the following spring. Clara had found the papers in his coat pocket the week after the burial, tucked behind a folded letter he'd been meaning to mail that she'd never been able to bring herself to open. $200. In 1874, for a woman with no husband and 8 mouths to eat, through what remained of the pantry, $200 might as well have been $2,000. It might as well have been the moon. She had parcelled out the meals. She had patched the roof with strips of canvas she'd cut from an old wagon cover. She had sent Thomas and her second eldest, 11-year-old Ruth, to school only 3 days a week now to preserve boot leather. She had sold the extra mule and traded 24 eggs a week to old Mrs. Harwick for thread and salt. She had done everything a woman could do, and still, every night, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and stared at the numbers she'd written in the margin of the family Bible because she had no ledger paper left, and the numbers said the same thing night after night, in the same patient, terrible arithmetic. It was not going to be enough. That was the morning, a Tuesday in late October, with a skin of frost on the grass and the sky the colour of old pewter, that she looked up from the well to see a man on a grey horse at the far edge of her property line. He wasn't riding toward her. He wasn't riding away. He was simply watching, still as a fence post, hat pulled low against the wind, the horse standing patient beneath him like it had been trained not to startle or rush. He was too far away to read his face. She could see that he was broad across the shoulders and that his coat was plain, dark wool, not a lawman, not a drifter's patched canvas. A working man's coat. Clara set her bucket down. She did not call out. She did not wave. After a long moment, the man on the grey horse turned and rode away south without ever having come closer. Thomas came out of the barn. He'd been mucking stalls, one of the endless boy jobs that had aged his face a half-decade since his father died, and squinted after the rider. "That's Elias Cord," he said, with the flat certainty of a boy who'd learned things quickly. "He runs the Cord cattle outfit. South quarter section butts up against the county road." Clara picked up her bucket. "What does he want with us?" Thomas was quiet a moment, then said something that lodged itself in the back of her mind and stayed there, quiet and complicated all through the rest of that long, cold morning. "People say he don't want much from anybody," her son said. "People say he just watches and thinks and then does what he decides to do." Clara didn't answer. She carried her water inside, started the stove, pulled May up onto her hip, and tried to feel the ordinary comfort of the flame catching. But the day had already changed its shape somehow, and she couldn't say exactly why, whether it was the number in the Bible margin, or the frost on the grass, or the man on the grey horse who had looked at her broken farm from a distance and said nothing at all, not yet. But something had shifted, the way the air shifts before weather arrives, before you can name it as storm or as mercy. She didn't sleep well that night, and in the morning he came back. This time he rode all the way up to the gate. He stopped there, didn't open it, didn't call out, just waited with his hat in his hands and the grey horse, blowing warm clouds of breath into the cold air. Clara watched him from the kitchen window for the better part of 2 minutes, the way you watch a thing you can't quite name before you decide whether it's worth opening the door to. Elias Cord was somewhere north of 40, she guessed. His face was the kind the frontier made, deeply lined around the eyes, weathered to a colour somewhere between leather and clay, jaw shaded with several days of grey-threaded stubble. He wasn't a handsome man in any decorative sense, but there was a steadiness in how he held himself, a quality of stillness that made Clara think of deep water rather than shallow. Still water could drown you just as easily, she reminded herself, and dried her hands on her apron, and went out. "Mr. Cord," she said, stopping 6 feet from the gate. "Mrs. Bowman." He dipped his chin. His voice was low, unhurried, with the faint, flattened vowels of a man who'd been west a long time. "I apologize for standing at your gate unannounced. I wasn't sure you'd want company." "I don't particularly," she said. "But I'm here. What is it?" A man of lesser nerve might have shifted or softened. Elias Cord simply nodded, as if her sharpness was a reasonable thing. "I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss. James Bowman was a fair man." "You knew him?" "Enough to know he was fair." A pause. "I wanted to ask if you needed help with the barn." Clara felt her spine stiffen in the way it always did when a man offered something that contained a price she couldn't yet see. "The barn's fine." His eyes moved to the barn without moving his head, the way a man looks when he's been polite enough not to point at the obvious thing. The barn was not fine. The southwest wall had developed a new lean since the last wind,
and Thomas had propped 2 timber lengths against it that weren't doing much more than making the problem look addressed. "I've got 2 hands finishing up on my south pasture fence this week," he said. "They'll have idle time after Thursday. I could send them over." "For what payment?" "None." Silence between them, filled in by the wind moving through the dead grass. "Mr. Cord," Clara said carefully, "I've been a widow 4 months. I'm not interested in charity that comes wrapped in expectation." Something moved across his face. Not offense exactly. Something quieter than that. He put his hat back on and looked at a point past her left shoulder for a moment, as if choosing his words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. "My wife died 9 years ago," he said. "In the spring, we didn't have children. I had 3 neighbors who helped me that first year when I couldn't see past my own grief to keep the cattle watered, and I've spent 9 years looking for ways to pay that back to people who needed it, because those 3 men are all dead now and I can't pay them directly." He brought his eyes back to hers. "That's the whole of my expectation, Mrs. Bowman. Take it or leave it." She stood there in the cold morning air and weighed him. The thing about survival, real survival, the feast, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically but shows up every day in the gap between what you have and what you need, is that it has a way of grinding moral caution down to a very fine edge. Clara Bowman was a proud woman. She was the daughter of a proud Ohio carpenter who'd taught her that self-reliance was the only reliable thing. She believed in earning what you received and receiving only what you'd earned. Those beliefs had served her well when James was alive, and the farm was producing and the books were close to balanced. James was dead. The books were not close to balanced. The barn wall was held up by 2 insufficient timbers and the optimism of a 14-year-old boy. "Tell your men to come Thursday," she said. "They can take their noon meal here." Elias Cord nodded once, put his hat brim down against the wind, and turned his horse south. No smile, no relief. Just the quiet execution of a thing decided. It should have felt simple. It didn't. By the time he was a dark shape on the southern horizon, Ruth had appeared at Clara's elbow with the instinctive radar of an eldest daughter. She watched the rider go with narrowed eyes. "Who's that?" "A neighbor," Clara said. "He's sending workers for the barn." Ruth was quiet for a moment, a careful, old, before-her-time quiet. "Mrs. Hadley says men don't do things for nothing." "Mrs.
Hadley," Clara said, starting back toward the house, "has buried 2 husbands and still hasn't figured out that not all men are the same man." But the thought lodged itself anyway, the way her daughter's careful thoughts always did, because Ruth was not wrong to notice what the town would say. In Millhaven, a widow accepting labor from an unmarried rancher was a story that would write itself without her participation, and the town would edit it in whatever direction made the best gossip. She knew that. She had known it at the gate. She had said yes anyway. Thursday, 2 men arrived with tools and lumber and a no-nonsense attitude toward the barn wall that made Thomas stand back and watch with the hungry attention of a boy absorbing knowledge he understood he needed.
They worked through the morning without much talk, which Clara respected. She fed them beans and cornbread at noon, and they tipped their hats and went back to work. And by late afternoon, The barn wall stood straight for the first time in 3 years. She should have left it there. But on Friday morning she saw the grey horse again at the property line, and this time she walked out to meet it. It was that decision, that single, unremarkable morning walk across frost-stiff grass, that the town of Millhaven would spend the next 6 weeks discussing. And it was that discussion that would bring, eventually and inevitably, the kind of trouble that doesn't knock before it enters. The first sign was the letter. It came not from the bank, but from the bank's lawyer, a man named Aldous Price, who operated out of a second-floor office above the Millhaven hardware store and wore his ambition like a second vest. The letter arrived the second week of November, addressed to Mrs. James Bowman, widow, in a script so formal it felt almost contemptuous, and it informed her, with the particular cruelty of legal language, which says terrible things in perfectly civil tones, that the note on the Bowman property had been assigned to a new holding company, and that repayment was now due not in spring, but in 60 days. 60 days was January. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and May asleep on the bench beside her, and the wind working at the corners of the house, and she read it 3 times, because sometimes the third reading changes the meaning. It didn't change the meaning. Price had never given her much thought before, she suspected, but Millhaven was a town where gossip moved faster than weather, and the gossip about the widow Bowman and the quiet rancher from the South Quarter had reached his ears in some shape or another, and Aldous Price was the kind of man who understood, with the cold precision of a card player, that a woman in a vulnerable position, surrounded by the murmur of impropriety, had less standing to fight. A woman with reputation questions and a debt notice was a woman who couldn't easily rally the town behind her. She told Elias on a Saturday morning, standing at her gate, the letter folded in her coat pocket. He read it twice, once quickly, once slowly. Then he folded it along its original creases and handed it back without speaking, and she watched the stillness in his face take on a particular quality, the stillness of a man who has felt rage before and long since learned to put the house in order before he lets it out. "Price," he said, "you know him." "I know what he is." A pause. He looked out across her farm, the straight barn wall, the stacked woodpile Thomas had grown over the past 2 weeks, with a kind of furious industry, the kitchen garden put to bed for winter. He's done this before, found notes in difficulty and bought them cheap and accelerated the terms until the holder couldn't comply. He's taken 3 farms south of the county road that way in 5 years. Then he knows how it works. He knows exactly how it works. Clara felt the cold more sharply then, not because the temperature had changed, but because understanding a problem fully has a way of stripping the warmth out of things. She had known the debt was a danger. She had not known the debt had been weaponized. The trouble that arrived the following Monday was louder. 3 riders came down the county road and turned up the Bowman Drive at noon. Not the hour of men on legitimate business, but the hour of men making a point. Clara was hanging washing when she heard the hoofbeats, and she had time to recognize the man at the front before he spoke. His name was Doyle Price, the lawyer's younger brother, which meant he had the same cold eyes and none of the restraint that at least made Aldous professionally careful. Doyle was flanked by 2 cowhands who looked like they'd been hired specifically for the impression of bulk and consequence. He didn't dismount. "Mrs. Bowman," he said, making the name a kind of filing away. "My brother asked me to remind you that the 60 days is a courtesy. The actual right of repossession accrues on default, and default begins the moment the note transfers." He looked around the farm with studied casualness. "Nice barn work. New lumber." Clara set her washing down. Behind her, she heard the back door of the house open and close. Thomas, she thought. She didn't look. "Your brother's letter was received. My affairs are in order." Doyle Price smiled with his teeth only. "Are they? Because word around town is your affairs are—" He paused, tilting his head in that particular way mean men tilt their heads when they're about to say something they've practiced, somewhat entangled with the Cord cattle outfit. Which is interesting, given that Cord has water rights on the South Quarter that my brother's been hoping to purchase, and a woman who owes our bank $200 makes an interesting sort of leverage. The word leverage sat in the cold air between them like something dropped. Clara understood it then. The full architecture of the thing, not just her debt, her proximity to Elias. The town's gossip being not merely social damage, but a tool in a plan that had been operational long before she had walked across that frost-stiff grass. She had been made into a chess piece without being asked. She kept her face composed. She had buried her husband. She had counted 8 children for 4 months without losing a single one. She had patched a canvas roof in the rain. She was not going to let Doyle Price read anything in her face. "You've delivered your reminder," she said. "Good day." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, quickly disciplined. He pulled his horse around. His 2 companions followed without a word. When the riders were gone, Clara stood in the silence of the yard for a long time. The wind pressed the damp washing against the line. May's voice came faintly through the kitchen window, some small song she sang to herself while she pushed wooden blocks across the floor. Thomas came to stand beside her. He was tall now. She noticed that sometimes in odd moments, how tall he had become. "I'll ride to Mr. Cord," he said quietly. "No," Clara said. "I'll ride to Mr. Cord." She saddled the mare herself, and she rode south in the cold afternoon, and she did not allow herself to think, not yet, about what she was riding toward. She only thought about the 8 children, and the number in the Bible, and the straight barn wall, and the $200, and the 60 days. She put the thoughts in that order and held them there, and rode. She arrived at the Cord cattle outfit as the sun was dropping below the tree line, turning everything gold and long-shadowed, and Elias Cord was standing at his own fence line as if he'd been expecting her, which she would later realize he probably had, because a man who watched and thought before he acted had likely been watching and thinking since Monday morning, when Doyle Price and his flanking men rode down the county road past the South Quarter and turned north. He opened the gate before she reached it. She didn't cry. That matters, the not crying, not because tears would have been weakness, but because Clara Bowman had long since moved past the place where tears were an available option. She had cried at the burial. She had cried 3 times in 4 months, alone at the kitchen table after all 8 children were asleep, quiet and efficient with her grief, the way she was efficient with everything. After that, the tears had gone somewhere else in her, somewhere deeper, where they became something more structural than water. What she did, standing in Elias Cord's kitchen while he built up the stove and put a coffee pot on without asking whether she wanted coffee, was tell him everything. The letter, the 60 days, the transferred note, Doyle Price at her clothesline, and the word leverage hanging in the cold air. She told it the way she told Thomas what needed to be done on any given morning, factually, with sequence and detail, without ornamentation. He listened without interrupting, his back mostly to her while he worked at the stove. She'd noticed this about him in their conversations at the gate, that he sometimes listened better while doing something with his hands, as if the movement in his body freed something in his attention to go elsewhere. When she finished, the coffee pot was heating and he turned around and leaned against the counter and was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was clean and spare in a way that suggested a man who had organized his life around absence, around the deliberate removal of excess. There were no decorative things except one, a small framed sketch on the wall near the window, charcoal on paper, the figure of a woman reading, done by an amateur hand but with visible care for the subject. Clara looked at it without commenting, and Elias noticed her looking. "My wife," he said, "Margaret. She drew herself sometimes, used to set a mirror on the table." He paused. "I kept that one because she was smiling at something in the book and didn't know I was watching." Clara said nothing, which was the right thing to say. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her, and took the chair across the table, and the stove made its small sounds, and outside the wind moved through whatever remained of autumn. May was not here. Thomas was not here. No children counting on what came next. For a single, strange moment, Clara Bowman felt what it was to simply be a person in a kitchen with another person, without the enormous weight of consequence pressing down on every breath. "I have the money," Elika said. She set her cup down. "No." "I have the money, Clara." The first time he'd used her given name, he said it without ceremony, as if it were simply the most accurate word. "Not a gift, a loan, documented properly, at no interest, repayable whenever your farm is producing at the rate it should be in 2 good years, which it will be." "You don't know that." "I know what your land is worth. I know what your barn can hold. I know your boy is already a better stockman than half the men in this county, and he's 14 years old." A pause. "I've been watching your farm for 6 months, Clara. Not in the way Price is watching it. In the way a man watches something he respects and wishes he could help." She looked at him. "And what does Price get from this?"
"If you pay my note, he loses his leverage on your water rights." "Yes. He won't accept that quietly." "No, he won't." She wrapped both hands around the hot cup. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, but full, the way silences get when 2 people have stopped performing and simply occupied the same space with their honest thoughts. "Why?" she said. "Not the debt story about the 3 neighbors. The real reason." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer.
Then he said, "Because I watched a family hold together when it should have broken, and I think that's the most valuable thing I've ever seen in all my time in Kansas, and the idea of Aldous Price disassembling it to make a point about water rights turns my stomach." He said it simply, without decoration, the way he did most things, It landed simply and stayed. After a moment, Clara said, "I have conditions." "Name them." "The loan is documented before witnesses, my name on the paper, not Thomas's, not yours, as guardian or overseer or anything similar. My name, my signature, my debt, my farm. It remains mine." "Obviously." "And I run the repayment schedule. You'll suggest nothing about the timeline. If I'm late, you wait. You don't appear at my gate offering extensions or adjustments."
"You wait because you trust my arithmetic." Something moved in his face, unmistakably warm this time, for just a moment, before he steadied it. "Your arithmetic has never been in question." She held out her hand across the table. He shook it, firm and brief, the handshake of someone who understood that this was not a social gesture but a binding one. She rode home in the dark, the stars extravagant overhead, in the Kansas sky the way they only get in deep winter, when the air is clean and cold and utterly indifferent to human affairs. She thought about Margaret Cord smiling at something in a book in a charcoal drawing. She thought about the number in the Bible margin.
She thought about what it meant that she felt, for the first time in 4 months, something that was not precisely hope, but was adjacent to it. Something structural rather than emotional, a recalibration of what was possible. 8 heads of hair on 3 mattresses. All 8. Still here. She was not going to let Aldous Price have them. Aldous Price received the bank draft on a Thursday morning. His clerk brought it upstairs to the office above the hardware store, and Price turned it over in his hands the way a man handles something he expected but still resents, reading the attached documentation twice, once quickly, once slowly, noting the names, the signatures, the witness attestations, the proper legal language that left him exactly nothing to dispute. $212 covering principal and all assessed fees, signed by Clara Bowman, witnessed by the county recorder and by Reverend Ashby, which was a particular touch Price recognized as deliberate. The Reverend being the one man in Millhaven whose moral standing made any subsequent legal maneuvering look exactly like what it was. He set the draft on his desk. He looked out the window at the Millhaven street below for a long time. Then he called his clerk back in and told him to close the Bowman file. That was how it ended in the offices of Aldous Price, not with confrontation, not with the dramatic collapse that might have made a better story, but would also have meant more damage, more cost, more risk to 8 children and a straight barn wall. It ended with paperwork, which is how most battles worth winning end, with the right words in the right order under the right names. What happened with Doyle was louder. He came on a Saturday, the last Saturday of November, this time with 4 riders instead of 2, and this time he came not to the Bowman farm but to the county road, where it met the south quarter fence of the Cord cattle outfit, which happened to be where Elias Cord and Thomas Bowman were mending the corner post, Thomas's hammer falling with the steady rhythm of a boy finding his competence in real work. Clara was nowhere near. She was at home with the younger children, which Doyle had probably calculated. He had not calculated Elias Cord, which was in the end his central operational error. Elias set his tools down before the riders stopped. He stood at the fence line with his hands loose at his sides in that still, deep waterway, and he looked at Doyle Price with an expression that communicated, without theatrical gesture, that he had been expecting this and had given it considerable thought. Doyle began with threats, which was his language and his limitation. He made 3, one about the water rights, one loosely aimed at Thomas regarding some claimed trespass, and one, more direct, about what happens to men who involve themselves in other men's business. He delivered them with the confidence of a man who had always found threats to be sufficient. Elias waited for all 3 to finish, rail, and stepped back. "That's the water rail," and stepped back. "That's the water rights deed," Elias said, "registered this week with the county. The Cord Cattle Outfit has granted shared access rights to the Bowman Farm under the terms described. It's already filed, already witnessed, already in the county records. Your brother's interest in purchasing those rights is now legally complicated in ways that would take 3 years to untangle in court, which would cost more than the rights are worth." A pause. "I also had a conversation this week with Judge Harlow in Abilene, who has some questions about the methodology by which your brother acquires distressed notes. That conversation is ongoing." The silence that followed was the particular silence of men recalibrating. Thomas, Clara would later learn, did not flinch during any of it. He stood with his hammer in his hand and watched Doyle Price's face move through 4 expressions and come to rest on the one that people wear when they understand they have been outmaneuvered so thoroughly that the only remaining move is departure with whatever dignity can be salvaged. Doyle turned his horse. His 4 riders followed. They did not come back. The winter that followed was hard in the way Kansas winters are hard, not dramatically, not with the narrative violence of blizzards and catastrophe, but with the relentless, ordinary grind of cold and work, and the question each morning of whether you had enough. Clara had spent 4 months learning to measure enough very precisely, and she spent that winter learning that her measurement had been conservative, that she had, in fact, slightly more than enough, and that the difference between barely surviving and genuinely living was smaller than she'd feared. Elias Cord came to Sunday supper in December. Clara had invited him directly, with the same straightforward tone she used for everything, and he had accepted with the same quality of quiet. He brought a jar of honey from his south pasture hives, and Ruth examined it with her careful, appraising eyes, and asked him technical questions about bee husbandry that made him smile in a way Clara hadn't seen before. Surprised and pleased, the way adults get when a child understands more than expected. The younger children were loud and occasionally terrible, as children are, and Elias sat in the middle of it without visible distress, which Clara noted. 7-year-old Caleb climbed onto the bench beside him uninvited and explained at length the feeding preferences of their 3 remaining chickens, and Elias listened with full attention, which was either genuine or the most convincing performance of genuine she had ever witnessed. She decided it was genuine. After the children were in bed and the lamp was low, they sat at the table with the last of the coffee and the comfortable silence of people who had been through something difficult in close proximity and found each other adequate to the difficulty. Clara looked at the Bible on the shelf, the number in the margin, those desperate evening calculations from the worst autumn of her life. She thought about going to it now, about what the numbers said with the note cleared and the barn straight, and 2 men who'd left Price and Price's methodology in the dust of a county road. She decided the number didn't need to be checked tonight. "The children like you," she said. "Children and animals tend to," he said. "It's people in the middle who take more work." She almost laughed. A real laugh, not the careful social kind. She controlled it, but the shape of it was there, and he saw it. The following spring came on like a slowly opening hand. The Bowman farm planted 20 acres of winter wheat, and the yield, come July, was better than anything James had ever managed, partly because of the new irrigation access from the shared water rights, and partly because Thomas turned out to have an instinct for it that no one, including Thomas, had known was there until circumstance removed every other option and left only his own competence to stand on. Clara repaid the loan in 2 installments, one in August, one in October, on exactly the timeline she had specified, with interest, which she had not agreed to but added anyway, because her arithmetic had always been in order, and she knew what the money had cost him to have available, and that cost had a value. Elias accepted it without comment, which was the correct response. He came to supper most Sundays through that year, and then the year after, and on a Sunday in November 1876, which was 2 years and 1 month after the morning he had first appeared on a grey horse at the far edge of her property. He asked her a question across the cleared table while the house settled into its evening quiet, and the 8 children's breathing filled the other rooms like a slow tide. She thought about his answer at her gate that first morning. "I've been looking for ways to pay it back because those 3 men are dead and I can't pay them directly." She thought about Margaret Cord smiling at something in a book, alone with a mirror. She said yes. Years later, many years, enough that May was grown, and Thomas had his own land, and Ruth was teaching school in Abilene, Clara Cord would sometimes stand at the kitchen window in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, and watch the frost on the grass, and remember that October Tuesday in 1874, when she had looked up from the well and seen a man on a grey horse at the edge of her property, too far away to read. She would think about what she had known then and what she had not known. She had known she was alone. She had known the barn wall leaned. She had known the number in the Bible margin was not going to solve itself. She had known that 8 children asleep in 3 mattresses were counting on her arithmetic, and her spine, and her willingness to walk across frozen ground towards something she couldn't yet name. What she had not known was that the man on the grey horse had counted her children too. Not that morning, not yet, but in the months that followed, in the same way she did, deliberately, carefully, one by one, making sure they were all still there. Outside the window the Kansas dawn came up slow and indifferent and enormous, the sky running from black to purple to the pale gold of something beginning, and the frost on the grass caught the light the way frost always does, briefly, brilliantly, before the day's warmth arrived and turned it to something plain and ordinary and necessary. She put the coffee on, she counted the children, 8, all 8, and, for the first time in a long time, 9.